We are currently in one of my very favorite areas of the South Island of New Zealand. This is Lake Tekapo, and this is the Church of the Good Shepherd. What makes this location extremely special is that the whole area is a black sky reserve. So that means that the sky stays extremely dark around this entire area. I came here for the very first time exactly 1 year ago, and I was able to create a really beautiful photo that involved quite a few complex steps. The photo did really well online, and it was even printed by Fujifilm and hung at Photokina. So tonight, I'm gonna walk you guys through the process from start to finish and how I created that photo. As we've been shooting the stars together, we've been getting increasingly more difficult over time. So tonight, we're gonna apply all of the things that we've learned so far and put together one awesome shot. Now, this shot will combine using natural light, artificial light painting, and the Milky Way in the night sky all together to create one seamless photograph. Another reason we're here filming at this time is it's summer in New Zealand. It's actually February, which is a great month to see the Milky Way because we can actually see the galactic core over the church. In the wintertime, you can still see some of the Milky Way, but you don't actually see the galactic core line up with the church. The Church of the Good Shepherd has become one of the most famous Milky Way viewing destinations of all of the South Island of New Zealand. Now, since that's the case, we can't be out here setting up video lights because it's going to disrupt hundreds of people's view of the Milky Way. So instead, we're going to film everything early. I'm going to walk you guys through this, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the settings, but we're not going to be able to film step by step in the dark. We're just going to have to talk about it, and I'm going to have to show you the result. Right now I'm here early trying to stake out locations, figuring out exactly where I want to set up my cameras and how I want to capture the night sky. As I said, this is a dark sky reserve, so it's going to be pitch black out here. So I need to come here during the day, figure out exactly how I want to set up, where my compositions are going to be, and plan so that I can get everything right when I get here at night. As we've already talked about, I knew that the Milky Way was going to be somewhere in the southern sky. So I used the app on my iPhone and I spun around to a composition I liked of the church and I checked it to see when the Milky Way was going to rise, so I knew when I needed to be set up and when I needed to get the shot. We're not just visiting this spot any day of the week. Tonight is a new moon, which means there's going to be no moonlight in the sky, making it the best time of the month to capture the night sky. Secondly, we have a clear sky in the forecast after dark, which means I may have multiple opportunities to capture the night sky. Since that's the case, and blue skies are very rare in conjunction with new moons, I'm going to set up multiple cameras. I'm actually going to set up 2 different cameras to capture the Milky Way, one vertical and one horizontal, and I'm going to pick the composition I like the most. Then I'm going to swing around to the front side of the church, set up a 3rd camera to capture star trails. The reason I'm using 3 cameras is it's the new moon and it's a blue sky, so this only happens every once in a while, so I want to make sure to take advantage of it to its full potential. Managing 3 cameras out here is not going to be an easy task at all because this area is extremely busy. Not only that, it's very disrespectful to shine your lights, your headlamps at other people's faces or at their cameras because you can potentially ruin their frame. Now, we're very mindful of other people, but there are going to be hundreds of people that come throughout the night and are going to watch the Milky Way, and not everybody is thoughtful with their light sources. So I'm going to have to protect these cameras not only from foreign light sources like headlamps and flashlights, but I'm also going to have to protect the cameras from people walking by. It's going to be pitch black out here. So what I like to do is buy a bunch of glow sticks before I shoot the night sky. And with each camera that I set up, I'm actually going to put a glow stick right on the ground, right underneath the tripod. Now, this will alert people that there's something there and something that they could potentially trip over. So hopefully it'll help them avoid my tripod, and it'll also help me find them when I'm moving from camera to camera. The last thing I want to do is shine my light around and potentially ruin my frame by shining the light right on the camera lens. Another simple thing that I like to do to assure that we don't have any potential light leaks that don't need to happen is just hang a hat over the back of my camera. Just in case somebody shines a light on the back of the camera, it won't ruin the frame. Something that I've noticed shooting in very busy places, especially iconic places where everybody wants to get a great shot, even if they're just using an iPad or an iPhone, is as soon as you preview the back of your camera, everybody will want to see the photo and talk to you about it. So hanging a hat over the back of it ensures that they don't get curious and potentially bump your camera. As I said, we're not going to be able to do all this live because we can't set up video lights out here because it would be very disrespectful. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the entire process of how I'm going to set up and capture this. Now, what I said is I'm going to set up 3 different cameras. Let's talk specifically about one of the cameras that's going to be capturing the the Milky Way. If you look directly behind me in this video, you can see the church. The front of the church actually faces south. So to get the Milky Way in the shot, I can't shoot the front of the church. What I'm going to do is swing around to the back and get a nice 3/4 view so that I'm actually looking down the front of the church, but facing the southern sky. This situation is unique because I'm letting the night sky determine the composition first. Then, based on the position of the Milky Way, I'm going to figure out the best compositional elements that I can use in the foreground to lead the eye right into the night sky. Since this is such a busy location, I'm going to do a few things that I don't normally do for every shot. The first thing is I'm going to put the camera position very low. The reason the camera is going to be positioned low is because by positioning it low, when I crouch down, the church will actually get higher up in the sky. So I'm going to end up with more church and it's going to pull the Milky Way down a little bit. The second reason is leaving the tripod so low, only extending one set of legs, changes the dimension here, so there's less for people to potentially trip over. If I put the tripod all the way up and it has its full leg span, then there's going to be more potential for it to be a hazard and people may trip over. Remember, the key to blending these shots together is going to be everything staying still as possible. If anything moves, it's going to complicate the compositing process. Another thing that I like to do, in addition to covering the back of the camera with the hat, I also like to close the viewfinder here a little bit just to minimize any potential light leak there. I also like to take a piece of gaffer tape and tape down the focus ring and the millimeter ring because I want to make sure that I don't accidentally fudge it in the dark or bump it. This will just give more protection to it changing over time. With this piece of tape, I also like to cover the little window on the top of the lens that shows my distance rating because sometimes, not on all lenses, but some lenses that can be light leak as well. I've decided on a few key things here. One is to shoot really wide so that I can get as long of an exposure as possible. If I stood back and shot at 50 or 105 millimeter, I may be able to have a lens that has maybe a low 1.4 rating on it, which would give me a better ISO, but I also have to do a faster exposure because those stars are going to start to move really quick if I'm zoomed in. When I'm wide, I may even be able to pull off a 30-second exposure before any visible motion in the stars. The second reason I've gotten really close is it's the potential to have less people cross the front of my camera. The further I set back, the more people are going to be between me and the church and the Milky Way. Once I lock down the composition, I'm going to make sure that I focus on the church. Now, the church might not be infinite, but it's infinite enough to the stars. A lot of people ask me if I like to focus on the foreground and the stars separately and then composite together, and my answer is no, because one, I want to simplify the process as much as possible, and two, I may need to blend parts of the church from the day shot to the night shot together, and if I change the focus, there's going to be seams. It's not going to be a seamless blend anymore. So once I lock down the focus, I'm going to wait for the best portion of blue hour. In this case, I'm going to wait for the very late blue hour. Now, we've been shooting blue hour for a while, and you guys know when there's still a little bit of blue in the sky, there's still a good blue hour. So what I'm going to do is wait till it's almost dark, perfect blue hour, and I'm going to get the perfect exposure with the lowest ISO possible. Once I have my perfect blue hour exposure, the next thing I'm going to do is light paint the church. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be sending Lee and Patrick behind the church with their panel light and also their iPhone lights, and we're going to try to illuminate all of the church windows. Once the church windows are illuminated, I'm going to do an additional exposure just for the lights. Now, I may need to do one or two so I can make sure that most of the lights are fully illuminated. Later, I'm going to blend that back together with the original blue hour frame in Photoshop. Once I have the blue hour shot and I have the lights from the windows to combine it, I'm going to wait till I see the Milky Way and the stars. Once the Milky Way comes out and it's full dark, I'm going to have to change my camera settings drastically. I'm going to have to go down to f2.8 and I'm going to have to bring the ISO somewhere between 1600 and 3200 to capture the Milky Way. With these settings, I'm also going to need an exposure time of somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds depending on my focal length. Remember before we talked about how the focal length will influence the streaks in the stars. So I want to make sure that I shoot as long of an exposure as possible without getting the negative effect of the streaks. And I think with this composition, I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be, should be somewhere between 14 and 18 millimeters, somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds is going to be perfect. This whole process may seem a little complex because we're blending the best parts of the blue hour natural light with the artificial light from the windows and the Milky Way. But remember that the light from the blue hour and the light from the windows is all captured with a very low ISO at f8. That means it's going to be razor sharp and noise-free. When I shoot the Milky Way at 1600 to 3200, it's going to be full of noise. So I'm not going to be able to push things very far, and I'm going to have to do some aggressive noise reduction. So that means that I know that the base of my frame, the rocks, the grass, the church, the lights, the windows will all be perfect, and I'm only going to have to deal with the noise in the sky. Alternatively, I could come out here and try to light the windows and capture the Milky Way at the same time, but then my whole foreground is going to be really grainy because it's completely dark and shot at a high ISO. So if you want the highest quality shot possible, employ these blending techniques to make sure you get them. One more thing to note that's very important is the white balance for the stars. Now this is going to be up to you. I like a white balance of somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 because I prefer a cool sky and a cool Milky Way. If you like it warmer, feel free to go up to 6,000 to get those warm tones. I prefer the cool tones, and again, that's completely up to you, but what you need to know is that you need to shoot consistency. So make sure that you set that, because if you leave it on auto, the camera's going to decide every single frame. So if you set it to what you like, you know you're going to get a consistent color accuracy throughout all of your shooting. So I've talked about capturing the Milky Way and the settings I'm going to use. Now really, I'm only looking for one clean frame of the Milky Way in the right position with everything perfect. I don't have to worry about any more than that. But I'm going to stay out through the night and I'm going to keep clicking, because sometimes if I click I might get a shooting star, or I might like the Milky Way rotated a little bit differently, but I can always choose the best one later in post. Now that I've talked about the two cameras that are going to be set up to capture the Milky Way in different compositions, here's the third setup designed to capture star trails. So everything here is going to be exactly the same, leading up to the point where the sky is completely dark and the stars are completely visible. The difference here is I'm not facing the Milky Way, so all I'm going to see is the normal constellations and the different points in the sky. Once all the clouds clear and I have a crystal clear window, I'm going to lock my shutter down and do consecutive 30-second exposures at f2.8, somewhere between ISO 1600 and 3200. If I can get a clean sequence of a lot of frames, I'll be able to take those into Photoshop and create those beautiful light trails around this iconic church. What I've found doing this over the years is I like to have somewhere between 100 to 200 star shots for a wide angle shot. So anywhere between 14 and 18 millimeter, which is where I typically shoot my stars, requires a lot more stars because at 30-second exposures, they really don't leave that much of a streak. So it takes a lot of them to really wrap around the sky or to cross the sky. Capturing the night sky is difficult enough with all the people around, but star trails are a whole different problem altogether. Since I need 100 to 200 consecutive frames, there's a lot of potential for error here, as if anything crosses the sky, just like you can see my hand here. If I had my iPhone in my hand and I was waving for my friends to come visit, you'd see that that would be wrecking the shot because I'd have light in the sky. So then when I stack the stars, I'd see the iPhone light as well. So people can light paint the church, they can sit in front of the church, take selfies in front of the church, because I'm only going to be using that one frame from the blue hour combining with the stars. So as long as nobody crosses those stars or shines any light in front of my camera, it'll be okay. But I'm still going to have to work really hard to make sure that the shot doesn't get ruined, especially considering I'm going to have two cameras over there and one over here. So with star trails, it can really be difficult in public places because you can get through 50 frames and then somebody could walk up to the front of your camera, shine a light on it, and ruin the entire sequence. Once you have a gap in stars, it's so hard to replace that it's almost not worth doing or not worth trying at all. It'll never look the same as a consistent pattern of stars. So the other reason that I like to shoot a lot is because somewhere in that cluster of shots, I'm going to find a perfect 100 or perfect 150 to use for the trails. Now that I've established how everything's going to go tonight, I have about an hour and a half before the sunset, so I'm going to run over to the other side, start carefully setting up all three cameras, get all prepared to capture the night sky. Hopefully everything goes as planned. I'm out here now, I'm all set up next to camera one. You can see I got that orange glow stick underneath. I've already captured my foreground shot. I've got everything through the blue hour. I had Lee and Patrick illuminate the lights in the church, it actually looks really cool. So now that it's full dark, we're starting to get the stars coming out and the clouds are starting to dissipate. So I'm really excited that within the next 30 or 45 minutes, I'm going to start to see the entire Milky Way, and it's going to be in the perfect position to be captured in my frame. So at this point, I have 3 cameras to manage, and this place is filling up with dozens of photographers and hundreds of people. Every few minutes, buses of people pull up and people come out, take all sorts of selfies, all sorts of different shots. And I'm really trying to be careful that they don't knock over my tripods or mess anything up. I've already been here for a few hours shooting through the blue hour and making sure that I capture everything perfectly in anticipation for the next 30 to 45 minutes when the Milky Way is in the perfect location. So at this point, guys, I'm prepared to spend the whole night here to get the perfect shot for us to work on. But right now, we're gonna cut off the panel light and I'm gonna focus on these shots. With the panel light on, I don't want to disturb everybody else since there's so many other photographers out here. So I've been out here for 9 hours. It's like 5:30 in the morning. I had to let those star trails run. I tried to do time lapses after I captured everything with all the cameras. I've been running back and forth between the cameras, stopping people from getting too close, preventing them from bumping my tripod. I even had this little kid run up and try to grab the camera. It was insane. I'm just about to pack it up for the night and finally get some sleep. But one thing I didn't anticipate, and something that wasn't here last year, were the sprinklers. It's insane. At about 2 a.m., the sprinklers started to turn on, and thankfully I'm sort of in this null area where I didn't get too wet. Cameras got a little bit wet, but other people, they were getting hosed down by these sprinklers. It was actually pretty crazy, and the sprinklers would turn off, 20 minutes, they'd come back on, turn off, come on, turn off. It was pretty crazy. It's not something that I remembered, and it was certainly an obstacle that I didn't anticipate going into shooting here. So I have barely sat down in the last 9 hours, but I think I was able to get a rockin' shot for us to work on. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. Today we are going to be taking star photography to the next level. This is the lesson where we were at the Church of the Good Shepherd. We set up multiple cameras and we captured the Milky Way over the church. A very beautiful scene. We also light painted the back of the windows, so we're going to have to take an early blue hour shot, marry it with the lights from the windows, color balance everything, and then bring in a layer of just the Milky Way. For this lesson, we're going to be combining everything we've learned so far and also learning some new advanced masking techniques. So let's get started. Well, let's talk a little bit about what I have in Capture One for you guys today. Well, this is going to be the base scene. And as you can see, this was ISO 64, 30 seconds, f8 at 19 millimeters. So remember, 19 millimeter, I had it set vertically, I had everything taped off and ready to go in anticipation for capturing the Milky Way. But before that, I had Lee and Patrick run behind the church here, and they illuminated these windows. Now, it was a directional illumination. I had them turn the light so that they could also get the front here. So it turns out that the lights on the windows are very bright here, the lights in the front are very bright as well. So we're going to use these two exposures, blend them into this base so that we can get the lights on in the church. And you can see here at the point that I started to capture this is still f4, ISO 400, so it should be nice and sharp. And you can see these are actually different. Shouldn't matter at all. Should be nice and sharp. And you can also see the Milky Way is just starting to come out at the end of blue hour. Now here's what I have as far as the Milky Way goes. You guys remember, you watching this, there were people everywhere. You saw the time lapses in the video, there were people all over the place shining the light. This little kid came and tried to grab my tripod. It was insane. It was actually a really rough night of filming and trying to keep everything in one place so that I could actually get these shots. Well, what happened is with all the people running around, now remember, if people are in front of the church, no problem, but when they're waving iPhones in front of the sky, it ruins the frame. If there's too many clouds, it ruins the frame. If a light shines on the front of the lens, it ruins the frame. So out of the whole night of shooting, I maybe only had a dozen shots where we could use the Milky Way. And check this out. So here we have the Milky Way is kind of risen already. This is a little bit later in the night. Check out earlier in the night. Earlier in the night, you can see that most of the Milky Way is actually still behind the church, and it's going up like this. So what I've done is I've given you guys two options to bring in for the Milky Way. Now I'm going to use this second one because I really like the way the Milky Way is rotated. But check this out, and this is a really important, this is something that's really important that I want to go over here, is the white balance. Remember, in the field, I set my white balance to a custom Kelvin temperature, and you can see that that was set to about 3569. You can see that it's the same here, but you can see the color is completely different. See, I have a little bit of green over here, but it's mostly blue, slight purple, and a little bit more dark blue on the top. Check out this frame that I'm going to use. See this green glow? That's actually not aurora. It's called air glow. And air glow is a scientific phenomenon that has to do with chemicals in the air and different light spectrums. I'm not really a scientist, but effectively what it does is it causes these different color waves of green and or pink. And you can see that later in the night, I ended up getting all this green, which in this case I'm going to use to my advantage. The problem with this kind of stuff, it's just much like aurora, is we can't really just do a color shift on it, because there's all of these different pixels that have some of this green. So it's just like green gas in the atmosphere, not an even line or an even gradation, but little patches of it. So you either have to use it or try to color correct it, but you can see in the top of the sky is already very blue. Just like this one, very blue and just a little bit of air glow over here. So we're going to try to color correct some of that. I'm going to show you guys options that you can go to get rid of it, but for the most part, if you end up with air glow, you kind of have to use it or try to do your best to color correct it out. The problem is this Milky Way shot looks much better than this one. But if you want, and you want to mitigate some of that green, feel free to swap these out. At this stage in post-processing, you guys should be able to use which files you want, even if I use different ones. That's why I'm occasionally including different ones, just to give you guys your own option for your own uniqueness inside of these images. But let's go ahead and get started. Before we start talking about the Milky Way, let's go ahead and build up our base layer. So this is going to be our base layer. We're not going to be using any of this sky, but we are going to be using the foreground here. And right off the bat, I think that it's a little bit too bright. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and unify the distortion correction on all of these images. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say 100, and I'm not going to do the sharpness fall off here because I don't want it in the sky. I'm going to say 100 and 100. And now the distortion is corrected. I'll just copy those adjustments. I'll select the rest of them here and paste those adjustments by applying them. Perfect. So now I know everything's going to line up. Next thing I want to go ahead and do is we'll go ahead and drop the exposure a little bit. Let's try a half of exposure, so negative 0.5. And that'll just darken it up a little bit because remember, we're trying to simulate night/blue hour, so it needs to be a little darker than sort of a fully lit scene. So that looks pretty good. Let's also go to the white balance here. I feel it's still a little cold, so I'm going to warm it up a little bit. Let's go up to maybe 10,000 here, so something very warm during the blue hour. And that's going to warm it up. That's going to change those values a little bit. Let's go ahead and even this out. Instead of 3.6, let's make it 3.5. So that looks pretty good. Now what I want to do is let's get this into Photoshop, and then we'll work on the light layers. So I'm going to export this first. Export with variance. All right, so what I've done is I have this here, so I'm going to copy it out. And I'm actually going to put it inside of this. I brought in a base layer. We're going to use that as our base layer. So I'll just go ahead and say to this one, we'll call it Blue Hour Base. We'll go back inside of Capture One here. And now let's go ahead and talk about these layers here. Well, effectively, all I need are the lights, but I'm just going to warm up a little bit of this light here, and I'm just going to go in to this menu here, and I'm going to take the shadows up maybe to about 10. So I'm just going to go ahead and unify that. The shadows here. And let's go ahead and select both of these, and I'm going to export them as variants. All right, let's get the first one. Copy this one out here. So there's one. Go to the second one here, do the same thing. And here's two. So basically, I'm going to put this one down first. We'll worry about this one second. And all I'm going to do here, and this is really easy, since I'm just trying to get the light transmission, I'm going to change this mode to lighten. And you can see with the lighten mode, those lights pop right in on the windows and illuminate everything around them. The other thing I want to do is just go ahead and lock this off. So this is the only area that I want this layer to affect. So I'm going to invert this selection, and I'm going to go ahead and black it out there. So here we go. So we have just this layer here. It's not going to affect anything else. We're going to go ahead and turn this one on. And I'll lighten that one as well. And let's see, does it do anything to the windows? Actually, yes, it does. See on the windows, it adds that little glow. It's really nice from the side. I think that looks great. The other thing that it's doing here is watch the tree on the left. Now, if you have light coming from the window, you should also get illumination on the tree. So we're going to go ahead and keep that too. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm just going to create a black mask here, and I'm just going to paint it in with a medium-sized brush and 100% flow. I'm just going to go ahead and paint it in on the windows here exactly where I want it, and we're going to paint it in here. Turn the flow down to about 20% here, and I'm just going to paint onto that tree so we can just take advantage of some of that light. That looks good. Perfect. Now something to point out here, I brought these layers in, but I don't need the entire layer. So what I'm going to do, just to save space, because this is going to be a fairly large composite, it might be the biggest composite that we've put together. So what I'm actually going to do is make a selection out of the areas that I use, and then I'm going to delete the areas that I don't use. So basically that just locks it in, saves me a ton of file space, and it'll keep this file moving and on track without getting the size too big. All right, so here's our base layer. You can see we have a solid foundation and we have some nice lights. It only takes a few minutes to create something like that. So if you're in a location like this and you have a chance to illuminate the lights, you have a chance to illuminate things that most people wouldn't think of, right off the bat you'll get a nicer image than everybody else. So right now let's go ahead and take a look at what we have. By itself, I actually kind of like this scene. It's already pretty ominous. It looks pretty cool, nice little church, actually a nice long exposure effect from the clouds. But what we want to do now is we want to create a mask. We want to create a mask so that we can actually put the Milky Way into the sky. Rather than painting it out myself or drawing, even though this is a very linear object, very angular, be pretty easy to do, I'm going to see if I can do it with a mask. And I have a feeling that if I go into the channels and I go to the blue channel, that I'm going to get a high area of contrast. But remember that trick I taught you guys already? We're going to go ahead and push the raw file first to see if we can get a better mask. So if I were to select the blues, clamp the levels, I already have that file exported from the raw. Theoretically, if I were to push this in the raw file, I'd be able to push it a little bit further because it has a higher bit rate. So what I actually want to do here is let's go ahead and put the exposure back to 0. What I want to do is just burn out this image so I can create a really easy mask. And the way that I do that is just clamping the values here. It's just like using curves or levels, and I'm going to pull this down, let's just say till the sky gets very, very white. And then now that I've done that, I've clamped all these levels, but you can see this is almost a selection in itself. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side and maybe take this down to about 50, 49 or 50. That looks pretty good. So obviously not a very pretty image, but we're going to go ahead and export this and we're going to use it as our masking base. All right, first step, let's go ahead and get this into our other scene. So we'll just go ahead and copy that in there, and I'll throw this right on top here. So we'll just go ahead and put it on top of everything. I'm going to click Save. I'm going to switch back to Capture One and get rid of the bouncing beach ball that we all love. So here we go. Now, remember, channels change every time that I have an active layer. So now this becomes my active layer. We'll go back into channels, and I'll actually show you guys here, have a little bit of cloud, and then blue, almost completely clean. So let's go ahead and make a duplicate of this and load up curves. Move it here so we can see what's going on. I'm just going to go ahead and clamp that a little bit, just a little bit like this. And I'm going to go ahead and clamp that just a little bit, just like that. And that looks pretty good. Well, with that in mind, we have to go in and start cleaning this up. So first thing I want to do is the easy part, which is going to be the white. So we'll just go ahead and, using the stylus, I'm using the medium tablet now, which gives me broader strokes, makes it easier to draw these types of masks. Zoom in a little bit here. You can see that the sky is really clean. Most of this is really clean. So I'll go ahead and first thing I'm going to do is make a very broad mask shape here, and I'm just using the lasso tool. We'll go ahead and flood this with black, and I'll go ahead and zoom in, and we'll start cleaning up these edges. So you can see these edges are already pretty close, and the nice thing is you can see that I've already selected most of the edge. So all I need to do is go in and very carefully clean up this selection that I've already made. We can do that very easily here. What I like to do too, when I'm doing this kind of masking, a lot of people will create one big mask. In other words, they'll just continue it. What I like to do is work on screen. So I'll just go ahead and do pieces and pieces like this. So I do one piece, fill it, and then I move on. This makes it much easier than working on a global thing. And just in case you accidentally let go of the Option key when you're drawing these masks, any number of things can happen. And it's sometimes for me it's easy. And even in this case with the Wacom stylus, I don't actually have to click. I can basically just freehand around all these things very easily. Or I can just hold the Option key and do a broad stroke just like that. So it's pretty easy here. You notice that most of the heavy lifting, I have to get a little closer to this just to make sure I get the edge just right. Most of the heavy lifting has been done already, and that's really nice. So the idea with these things is I always like to do as much or the least bit possible when it comes to masking. We're going to get into some more precision masking with this file, but there's no reason why we can't do a lot of the work with a simple luminosity mask. And what's funny too is, I don't know if I've said this in the other lessons because we've been filming these over the course of a few weeks, but a lot of these techniques, this is what I call channel masking or channel clamping, different things like that. I've been doing this since Photoshop version 5. So this is something that's been built into Photoshop for a long time. So it's given us power even before there were real terms for this kind of work. Well, I'll just go ahead and wrap this up here. Very carefully around the edge, very carefully around the edge. That looks pretty good. See, we're almost at the end of this. Now a little bit of spill is going to be okay. Basically, the takeaway from this is, yes, it's a little tedious, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that we always cut a little bit inside. So we use the luminosity mask or the channel mask to get the most of the brunt of the edge done, and then we can just go in and make small cleanups here and there as needed. We'll just go ahead and leave those two holes in the church. That's fine. We'll go ahead and zoom all the way out. I'll deselect this. I'll save in the background. And now what I'm actually going to do is name this Sky Mask Original, just in case we need to save a different version. I'll select it, re-enable this, turn this off because we're actually done with it. And now I'm going to create a folder with a mask on it. And this is going to become our Milky Way. Perfect. So now that we've established our base layer, let's go back into Capture One and establish which shot we're going to use for the Milky Way. And this looks really bad, so I'm just going to change it so we don't have to look at that burnt out image the whole time. All right, so basically here's what we have. We have this one, which I explained has the air glow, kind of looks like a green aurora. In this part of the world, often with light aurora activity is going to be pink. But we experienced for a few days, we kept experiencing this green sky. So I did a little bit of research again and found out that it's actually air glow, which is a pretty natural phenomenon. But what's interesting though is going through all my files from earlier in the night all the way to the end, the green glow, the green air glow didn't happen until about halfway through the night and into the morning. In the beginning it was very clean. But unfortunately, that was before the Milky Way really came up and rose. So I'm going to go ahead and work with the green. I just want to show you guys before that though. We're going to make some small changes to this, but I want to show you guys some options here just in the white balance. So the Milky Way stuff, you kind of have two camps of people with the Milky Way. You have people that like sort of a tungsten look or a warm look, or people who like a incandescent look or a cold look. I'm in the camp that likes the cold look on the Milky Way. I don't really like the warm, reddish, orangish sky. I kind of like the purples, the blues, the greens, the yellows, all those soft colors that can go and tone the Milky Way. So that's completely up to you. But we know that if we shoot an auto white balance, we can always change the white balance. So you can see as shot here, the Kelvin 35 59, but if I change a few things, like let's say I change it to incandescent, you're going to see it's going to pull it and make it really cold. In my opinion, that's way too cold. That's why I do all my white balancing in camera, because I try to get the core of the Milky Way to be pretty neutral, and then the colors around will kind of take the form that they naturally have depending on the glow, depending on if there's aurora activity, depending on if there's low glow from the lights or city lights or any kind of things like that, street lights. So you can see as shot through that way. But as you start to change it, you can see you can cool it down or you can warm it up, depending on what you want to do. But I caution you from doing too much outside of what's shot, especially when you have this kind of glow. Because if we try to get rid of this, we can try to cool it down a little bit. And you can see we can make it really blue, and then we can compensate by pulling up the magenta. But even then you can see it doesn't look as natural. And maybe that's the best we can do, but you can see these little strips of green that are still happening in yellow. That's because that air glow actually exists, and it's not an even gradation. So in this case, I'm going to go basically as shot, and I'm going to use that air glow to my advantage. But I'm going to do one thing that's a little bit different. Instead of actually just changing this, I'm going to go into the highlights here in the color balance, and check this out. On the right in the highlights, I can change the luminosity of those highlights, and you can see that I can pull just the star values up. So by pulling this all the way to the top, I can actually bring the stars out and add a little bit more detail. So we're going to leave this alone, change the highlights here, and I'm going to go back here, and now I'm going to do one other thing. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to add shadows, which you can see because that's actually bringing values out in the sky. What I'm going to do is clamp the levels a little bit. So just like we did with the mask, I'm going to actually pull this down to about 180. And you can see that that just pulls the details out of the Milky Way layer. So basically that's all I'm going to do is just accentuate the Milky Way there. You can see now that I've pulled the 180 on the clamping there, if I change this again, you can see that you can really see that intensity change. So we're just going to ramp that all the way back up, and we're going to get this inside of Photoshop. So I'll export a variant. Go ahead and select this here, and we'll go ahead and paste it right into the folder here. We'll just drag it in, and you can see now we have our Milky Way layer. All right, so let's really check this out. So we have our Milky Way, and again, we're still working on the blend. Let's go ahead and zoom in here and see what's happening. So our mask is pretty good overall. It's actually really good. But here's a big problem. If I toggle this mask on and off, I want you guys to notice something. Look at the lighting here. So it may look like the church has shifted a little bit, but what has actually happened is the discrepancy between shooting at f8 and f2.8 are so different, so your edges end up being soft. So throughout this tutorial, throughout every tutorial that I've created and you guys have watched me on, I've talked about f8 being the sweet spot on the lens. Well, now we're starting to see that take effect. So here's f2.8, and then here's f8. Notice how sharp that is. Well, this causes a problem, whether you're focus stacking or you're doing any kind of compositing, because edge to edge, when you start moving that f-stop, they're not going to line up anymore. So even though we have a mask that we've generated from the base layer that's perfect around the edges, it's not going to match up because our edges are no longer lining up with each other. There's going to be a little bit of overlap, almost like you've blurred it a few pixels, because that's the way it works with the f-stop. If we were to have generated the mask on this layer, it would have been the opposite problem. We would have had an extra layer missing, sort of an extra gap between the two layers. So I went ahead and did it on the sharpest layer, the least grainy layer, because I'm going to end up with the best mask. But it's still going to cause some issues because now we have to fix this object. So you can see this bad edge. So here's the problem. If we start to, and I'm just going to do this with a mask, just painted here. If I start to mask some of this out, you can see that I'm going to bring in some of the ugliness of the church. There is no way to get that color to line up with the church. And we'll also negate the reason that we shot this church at f8 anyway, because we want the perfect, printable, noise-free foreground, and then we want to be able to soften the heck out of the sky to make sure that we have a really nice Milky Way layer. So what do? Well, think about it this way. Outside of this church, what matters the most? It's the Milky Way, right? It's not the edge of the church. So we can't actually draw an edge for these to line up and live, one in front and one behind the other. We actually have to warp it a little bit and make it work. So this is something that I find myself doing in images all the time. Even if we perfect this mask, there's no way it's going to line up. But what we can do instead, and I'm just going to duplicate this layer now, just in case I make a mistake. And this is going to seem funny, but I can actually just grab selections like this. I can use a Command-J to duplicate it, right-click, and free transform. And then I can also warp. And when I warp, watch what happens. See that brown ugly edge? I can just pull it right in on itself, just like that. And it disappears. I can hit Enter, merge down with Command E, and I can just go into these layers here, and that was a little too close. I'll grab the marquee tool again, and all I'm going to do is just do something like that. Command J, Command T, right-click, warp, and I'm just going to start pulling those edges in. Nobody's going to notice if the stars are a little bit warped. It's actually a way that we can get away with this. Same thing here. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and grab this here, and I'm going to do the same thing. We're just going to do this all around the church. Just a little tiny bit, just to get rid of those ugly edges. So around here too, anything that seems to work, we have a little bit of a problem here on the roof. Let's just double check anyway. Again, some of this is not going to be a big deal, but yeah, see, that works really well. We'll leave that spot, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and use the marquee tool this time, or the lasso tool, and I'm going to draw around this area here, and I'll go ahead and duplicate from the base layer here and warp it. So basically what I'm doing is just warping that roof edge down inside of itself. We'll go ahead and flatten that one, flatten this one because I forgot to before. We'll zoom out a little bit with this roof. I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm just going to go ahead and draw a lasso around here. And we'll go ahead and warp this one too. This one's just going to take a little tiny bit just here and here. Perfect. Those people kind of freak out when I show them this. It's one of the last things you'd actually think to do, but it's one of the easiest ways to get the edges to work. So anytime I've done some of my famous shots involving some focus stacking, there was one where I had the gargoyles on Notre Dame in Paris. This is the technique that I did. After I blended them together, I actually just warped the surrounding pixels in on themselves so that it, whoops. You want to make sure, just to give you guys a hint though, make sure that you always duplicate a layer just in case you create seams. If you have a duplicate, it can always sit on top of itself without creating seams. We're almost done here. I'm just going to have to do this on the side. Whoops. We're just going to have to do this on the side of the cross. Do this one more time. There we go. Looks pretty good. And I'm a perfectionist. Can't help it. There we go. Looks good. Top of this here. Looks good. The top, perfect. This other side should be pretty good. That actually looks pretty good. Awesome. All right, so here's the next thing we're going to do. I'm going to go all the way over to this other side, and we're really going to talk about the edges here. We've created what's called an edge mask. Now, this is very important. An edge mask means that we've literally selected around the edge of an object. Since it was a clamped edge means that it's going to darken and lighten the surrounding pixels, meaning that it's going to get rid of that thin layer of anti-aliasing. So one-to-one black and white in Photoshop isn't going to be an edge that we see here. It's not going to be crispy on the edge because it's going to have anti-aliasing. We've destroyed that, so we need to put it back. The only way that we can put it back is to soften this mask. So if I double-click on it, watch what happens. If I just feather this by 1 pixel, watch what happens. 1 pixel, and now we get a halo. Why is that? That's because this is an edge selection. So it's actually not exactly the selection that we're looking for. We need to go in on the edge. So when you're selecting something, if we were to have selected this church, on our own without using a channel mask, we would have had to click or draw with a Bezier pen, any way that we would have had to do it. We would have wanted to do that 1 pixel in from the edge. Because when we did any kind of feather, half a pixel or otherwise, 2 pixels is too much, it would have caused a halo. So here's how we fix this. Let's go ahead and turn this feathering down first so that we get the mask the way it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load this as a selection. And you can see that it follows that edge almost perfectly, almost seamlessly. What I'm going to do here is, we know that if I feather this out, it's going to feather away from this edge here and I'm going to get a halo. So what I'm actually going to do is go up to the select menu. I'm going to say modify, and I'm going to expand this by 1 pixel. And now you can see if I zoom in, we've expanded it to the inside. So now it's inside the edge at 1 pixel. So what I'm going to do now with this mask, and we'll look at the mask itself, I'm going to go ahead and flood this with white. And you can see that now I'm going to cut inside of that edge. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go back to the channels and I'm going to make a new mask here, just in case I mess something up, and I'm going to call this Sky Mask Clamped. Perfect. All right, so now I have this. Now that I have that layer, you can see it's already starting to look better. I don't have any haloing at all. But now what I can do is go back in and I can add that feather. If I add too much, you can see I'll start to get the halo. But since it's inside by 1 pixel, I can feather it by up to 1 pixel, even a half a pixel, and now I end up with a perfect edge around the entire church. And I'm going to zoom in at pixel level here, and you guys can see there's a few little spots where I needed to pull in a little bit more, which we can still fix if we want to. But for the most part, now I've created a seamless edge around the church. The church looks good, but notice we have some problems here. Now obviously this is all grass. It moves, it blows around, people do selfies in it, all sorts of stuff happens here. What we're actually going to have to do is we're going to have to blend in some of the grass from the background, because you can see it's kind of a crunchy mask that we've created here. Notice that that has some color problems, but I'll show you guys the difference. If I try to blend it out, you can see that I'm going to lose some of the sky. So that's impossible. I'm not going to be able to do that because we're going to notice there's going to be Milky Way missing. What I'm going to do instead is start to blend some of this grass in to the original foreground that we created. So this is kind of a pain because we have to be very, very careful, and we just want to make sure that we can get sort of a soft edge. So now we're using some of the sky, and we've basically destroyed the perfect mask that we've created, but we're going to do the same thing here. See the problems with the trees here? This is what a lot of people forget to do. We actually have to use some of the trees from the sky. That's really the only way that we can get around this, or else we're going to end up with these really crispy edges. On screen resolution, 2048, 1280, whatever you guys save to Facebook, 1080 for Instagram, nobody's ever going to notice this. But the second you try to print it, you're going to notice. You're going to notice those edges, and you're going to wish that you did it right. But that simple thing is all we need to do, and now we have a perfect mask. Let's take a look at this image as a whole. Looks good here, perfect edges on the church, glowing foreground lights, everything's starting to come together, but this looks wrong. It looks like it's lit because it was lit, so we need to get rid of that pink color. So before we can call it a day here, we actually have to do a very simple color correction here. I'm just going to make a selection, just like this, and inside of the same folder, I can go ahead and delete the original Milky Way because we know that we did that one right. And I'm going to create a hue and saturation layer. And inside of, let's just go with yellows right now, I'm actually going to pull the lightness down. Actually, let's see. Yeah, start by pulling the lightness down and some of the saturation. I just want to get that grass to a neutral tone. Notice I'm starting to get some of the sky in there. What I'm going to do is start pulling out some of the green until I lose the sky, and I'll just add a little bit of red. There we go. That looks pretty good. So you can see toggle this on and off, and you can see now I've just kind of removed. It's not removing the color so much. The color will stay, but what I'm doing is just kind of removing the heat. And when I remove the heat of the layer, I'm removing the attention that it draws to the eye. And the same thing here, whoops, same thing here, I can actually go in, I'll show the mask while I do this, and I can actually just softly feather it a little bit. And where I don't need it here, I can also brush it out, just like this, just in case I started to pull in some of the sky. But you can see now if I zoom back out, the way that it looked like before this, it was very distracting, very neon, but now it looks very subdued and it doesn't distract from the viewer. Before we move on to the next step, there's probably some things we should address. We have to do one more pass to decide whether or not our masking is 100% intact, or anything, any details we missed, any edges that need to be fixed before we move on to the next phase. There's also something I really don't like here. Every time I visit the Church of the Good Shepherd, I still recommend going there if you're in the area in New Zealand. Every time though, they build more structures, they build steps, they build signs, they have posts and barricades and all sorts of stuff. And you can see I did my best to set up with a good composition, but I did end up with some collateral damage, which is this metal post. So let's see what we can do about getting rid of this metal post. Create a new layer, and we've done, remember back to Rome, we got rid of that weird tractor thing. Maybe we can do the same thing here. Well, let's see. Let's at least try. I'll pick a flow of about 30. I'm going to zoom right in on this, and this is anytime, oh, I hate it when there's weeds and stuff like this around this, or plants, because we're going to have to destroy some of them to get it to look right. So let's just see if we can get rid of, and using a broad stroke here, let's see if we can get rid of most of this post without it looking wrong. And so far that looks pretty good. Let me just see if I can go ahead and continue that luck here up to this rock. And that actually doesn't look that bad. Now I just got to go in and clean up some of these areas, clean up some of the grass without adding more grass. Let's just go ahead and do that here. Now remember, I think that having little mistakes in the cloning here is probably going to be a little bit better than actually having that giant obnoxious post. So that's, at least in my mind, that's what I'm hoping for here. So for something like this, I need to go ahead and grab some of the rock or gravel from here, and then I need to go ahead and transfer it to this area here. Cloning is one of those things that becomes easier over time. You start to get a little bit more ambitious with it each and every time you do it, to the point where you start to try things that you might otherwise think have been impossible. But you'd be surprised, the more you do it, the easier it gets, and the more natural your results start to look. So this is a little bit tricky now. What I'm actually going to do is draw a selection around this. We're going to go ahead and create the edge of a rock here. A rock, the rock, not Iraq, the country. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and select, modify, feather, 1 pixel so it has a nice soft edge. I'll zoom in a little bit here. This looks like it's marble. So I'll grab some of this nice marble texture down here, and we'll go ahead and continue some of that trend of marble, just like that. Perfect. I'll go ahead and invert this selection. So now I'm just going to work on the outside of it with that same tolerance of pixel feather. It should look pretty good here. Let's go ahead and bring some of these dark rocks up at a lighter opacity just to blend that in a little bit more seamless. I'll deselect that. That looks pretty good. And now let's just go ahead and focus on this a little bit here. Follow those edges and just start to paint it in. We've done this a lot. And if you continue along this path of this style of photography, get used to it. There's always something in the way. There's always going to be something in the way you can get rid of, and especially in these areas where people visit all the time. And we got really lucky here. I picked some frames that don't have many people, so we don't have to remove anybody, thankfully. Just clean some of this up. Bring some of this out here. Looks pretty good. Rocks are pretty easy, to be honest. Not a whole lot you have to worry about here. That looks pretty good. Let's bring some of this out and soften that in. Soften this in a little bit. Perfect. Zoom that out a little bit. And I think it needs a little bit more work here. We'll bring some lighter color there and some other things. But for the most part, if we zoomed out, nobody knew that the post wasn't there to begin with, then we pretty much have a win. So we'll just call this OBJ removal. That's obviously not how you spell removal. I will call this lights. Lights 1. Lights 2. And I'll just go ahead and save everything now. At this stage, we've pretty much blended everything out. We just have to go in if there's any other objects we need to remove, if there's any changes that you want to make here, if you wanted to make these more or less intense by changing the opacity a little bit, which I recommend just leaving them all the way up. Same thing with this one here, more or less of the opacity. I recommend just keeping it all the way up with the lighten mode. If we're happy with everything here, we'll just go ahead and take everything and we'll just call it blend. So I'll name this blend. And I'm going to use the Shift Option Command E to create a layer based on everything in our composition. And now let's go ahead and do some simple Color Effects Pro just to start bringing the contrast up. So I pulled the contrast out at the beginning for the blend. Now I'm trying to put all that contrast back, and we're going to start working on the color, texture, contrast, and the next phases. So we'll go up to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro to get it started. It's full screen, that guy, so we can see it. So we're going to do actually this looks like that was actually how I had it picked before. Now let me just go ahead and zero it out. We're dealing with different color temperatures here. I wanted to warm everything up, so if I change the correct color cast, you can see how it's warming everything up. If I pull the dynamic contrast up, change the color cast, you can see it's giving my scene, it's starting to warm it, and then it gives it sort of a magenta cast. So I think I like the trend of warming that I was going to do anyway, so I'll trust this filter to go ahead and do it at about 70%. I want to correct the contrast just a little bit here, and I also want to go ahead and do some more dynamic contrast because that always looks good. We'll do 20%. And if I toggle this on and off, you can see it's blowing out my lights. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to fix it again in Photoshop when we get out of the filter package. I'm going to add one more filter. You would never use a polarizer when you're shooting the night sky, but the filter polarization actually does pretty nice things to the colors. So check it out as I turn this up. It's actually going to pop all those colors out and add a little bit more contrast in the sky. So let's just bring that up to about 120%. Perfect. So we have the pro contrast, we have the polarization, looks pretty good. Let's apply this result. Let's take a look at our result here. Now, again, everything looks, I love the way it's doing, all the color to the sky, foreground looks great. This looks bad. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to fix this by just using the luminosity of the RGB channel. And you know that that's going to mean that the highlights are selected. So with the highlights selected, I'll hold Option, create a new mask, and I've basically done this. I've knocked out the shadows. And you can see that before and after here, I'm affecting everything but those shadows. Well, let's go back into that because, hold up, I really like the way it looks here and here. I'm just worried about the windows. So I'm just going to go ahead and clamp this the opposite way just to pull all that back, just like that. And all I really want to do is affect those windows here, stars, that's all fine, just like that. And now you can see that those windows are no longer blown out, but I still get all the detail and everything else. I'll go ahead and merge this down to the original, and I'll name it Color Effects Pro CEP Contrast / Pola. And I'll just go ahead and do a save in the background when we move on to the next step. Now that we've done some basic color adjustment, it's time to address noise in the sky. So we've used a very nice foreground that has very little noise because it was shot at ISO 64 on the Nikon D810. It's great. But at the top here, you can see we have a lot of noise in the sky because it was shot at ISO 1600 at f2.8. So it's going to be a little bit different. So what I want to do is the first thing is establish how much noise reduction I want to use. And the first thing we're going to do is load the filter under Nik Collection, Define. Define is my favorite filter for getting rid of noise, but we have to run through some things. Okay, now that Define's loaded, let's go ahead and bring it up full screen. Here's the problem. We've talked about this in stars already. If I slide this, the automatic adjustment, look, it hasn't really gotten rid of much of the noise at all, just a little bit. And if I go down here to sort of the meat of the scene that we're really concerned about, you can see that it hasn't mitigated much of that noise at all. Well, what happens if I do a manual detection around these stars? There's nowhere in the sky that I can select that doesn't have stars. And if we're looking for noise patterns, what do you think stars look like? Well, they essentially look like noise, right? So if I create a selection and I measure the noise, it's going to just go nuts on the sky. And you can see that it's softened everything, but it's also softened the stars. Well, that's okay. Let's go ahead and apply it, and let's use a new technique to knock some of those stars out. So I'll say, okay, this is about as heavy duty as you would possibly want to go with your softening in the sky. And let's see what it does to the scene. Big difference. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. Look at the church. Look at the edge of the church. But look at the sky. No, look at the clouds of the Milky Way. They're still intact. See how they look a little bit creamier? It's nice. The Milky Way actually looks great. The stars don't look so good, but the Milky Way looks really nice. Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get that softening layer to not destroy the foreground. It looks like a Crayola crayon painting. It's a disaster right now. So the first thing we're going to do is go back into this folder. Since we already have this mask that we've already created, let's go ahead and create a new folder with a mask on it that's just going to be called Sky. With that in mind, let's take this Define layer and let's put it in the sky. There. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now we only have that softness in the sky. But what if it's too much? How do we get those stars back into our image? Well, check this out. First thing I'm going to do is just go ahead, turn off the Define layer so that everything's intact, and I'm going to go back into the channels and I'm going to load the luminosity. And I'm going to load this into a mask so we can look at it. I'll delete it later, but I want you guys to see what's going on. Well, check this out. Do you guys notice something here? What are the most luminant objects in this scene? Stars, right? So the stars now are selected with part of the sky removed. But what happens if I would to do something like clamp it? Let's go ahead and bring up the curves. Is there a way that I could just isolate, let's say, the stars? Well, absolutely. If I start to clamp this, I can actually isolate just these stars and parts of the Milky Way. Very easy. See that? See how I'm able to do that? Perfect. So it may look ugly, but basically what I'm going to do here, remember nothing matters inside of this church at all. So it doesn't matter what's selected because that's just going to be on the define layer. If I go ahead and load this as a selection and select the define layer, hold Option, create a new mask, well, check out what happens here. What I've been able to do now is the define is applied, but it's not applied to the stars. If I hide this mask, you can see what define looks like applied to the stars. Notice how it's fainter? Well, with this mask, looking like this, all I've done with this mask is I've said put define on everything but the stars. So it's a very powerful way to pop the stars back out and get rid of all the noise in between them. It's probably my favorite technique for aggressive noise reduction in the sky. Right now, we're still losing some of them, which is fine. We're going to do a few things to sort of pop those back out. But for the most part, we've been able to soften everything around our areas of detail and to bring them back. Even here in these areas of the Milky Way, you can see we'll end up with a soft Milky Way, but we'll end up with all the stars and the details that we want. So we're going to go ahead and keep that the way it is. We'll call that sky. Now that we have that going on, let's go ahead and create another mask because we're going to be using this later. I'm going to invert it. And I'm going to create another folder with a mask on it. And I'm going to call this foreground. I'll just call it FG. I'll hit save just in case. So we have our layer and mask set to the folder, so anything we do for the sky specifically can go in here, anything in the foreground can go in here. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take the sharpening out right now. We'll go ahead and do a high pass filter for the sharpening, a 3-pixel radius, and you can see that I'll just go ahead just to keep things very organized. This will stay right in the foreground, and I'll set this to overlay. So basically now I should have these really sharp details here, which look pretty good. And then also everything else in the sky. So we have just the sky up there. It's going to be soft right around the edges. Looks pretty good so far. But now we need to do some more things. Let's go ahead and start talking about color correction. So remember, I've been saying for a lot of the files that we've been using, we've been able to shoot at f8. We've been shooting at ISO 64, ISO 100, very low ISO ratings. So we've been able to take things and push them to pretty far, actually. We've been able to push things really far in both Camera Raw, in both plugins and different things in Photoshop. But once we get down to these higher ISO things, it gets harder to push. The more we push it, the more it's going to cause the contrast in the grain. The more we push the color, the more we're going to notice the color artifacting. And there's only so much we can do to mitigate that, and I've already done that with the noise reduction. So what we're going to have to use is some subtle techniques, some curves and some luminosity masks to sort of get our values to all just feel like they belong, to create this harmony with all these elements together. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So let's go ahead and talk about the sky first. So the first thing I want to do here, we'll go ahead and hide the foreground. We'll open up the sky. And above this layer here, I'm going to set our first curves layer. Please, when you're doing your Milky Way shots, if you Google how to post-process the Milky Way or process the Milky Way, you're going to see a lot of tutorials where people they'll take the curves, they'll create an S-curve, they'll clamp the curves, and I call it overcooking the Milky Way. There's a lot of really beautiful work out there. It's subtle. You still see some details, but just please don't overcook the Milky Way. It's starting to become kind of a bad trend where you just see these overblown colors and these crazy neon horizons and everything like that. Let's just really try to keep it subtle together, then just like we do with the colors and everything and doing everything manually instead of HDR. I feel like the Milky Way is kind of getting out of control. So I want to show you guys some easy, subtle ways to enhance everything. Well, right now with the sky selected, what we can do is we can increase the intensity of the stars just by bringing up the brightness of the sky here. But we get a negative effect too because we're trying to keep contrast in the sky. So with the curves is really easy because we can always lock curves. And if we lock the shadows, you can see that we'll actually add contrast. So this is just going to add contrast on the horizon and contrast in the Milky Way. When you start doing stuff like this is what I'm talking about. It's like, yes, we have crazy detail in the sky, but just don't do that. It's too much. We have to do this in subtle little bits just to bring everything out, just a little bit at a time. And that's what we want to do. And remember, this is global, but we can do the same thing. Let's say that we duplicated this curves layer. Just Command J, and Command J will duplicate that again. Well, let's go ahead and do the same thing, but this time I'm going to take it up a little bit more than I probably should, just for an example, just like that. But instead of doing it this way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to black it out, and I'm going to use one curves as a base layer for my overall color adjustment, and then I'm going to take a brush, and I'm going to pick a flow of maybe 10%, and I'm just going to start to paint that area back into the Milky Way. So then I can just go ahead and accentuate the details that I want to accentuate around this element without having to cook the rest of the sky. So that's going to become a powerful way for you guys to do selective editing on the Milky Way. Once that's selected, then you can decide how much you want this to come out. And it's very easy. So just grab levels that you like, and it'll give you a way to pop these details out without destroying every other thing that you do around it. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and give the sky a break for a minute, and let's concentrate a little bit on the foreground now. With the foreground, I love our church, I love the rocks and everything, but basically what I want to do is create some contrast in here. And I want to darken it up a little bit. I feel like it's a little bit too bright. So inside of this layer, let's go ahead and create another curves layer. Curves just like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down. So this is going to be ramping, and you can see all of my levels are right here, so it should be pretty easy to understand. And then what I'm also going to do is add contrast to it. So we're going to go ahead and bring some levels up, some levels down, just like this. And what I'm going to do with this selected, I'm going to go ahead and draw a gradient. So I'll hit G for the gradient tool, and I want this to start from the bottom and go up to the top to about here, so that we get something that goes darker from the base and lighter to the top. So I might actually want to end this right around the base of the church, just like this. And it's not really vignetting, but what it's doing is pulling some of the detail around from the ground, making it feel like it's a little bit darker, and then pulling the attention into the church and into the Milky Way. Well, let's take this to the next level here. I'm just going to take off my color corrections first. And you can see the before and after. That's actually a pretty powerful result. Let's go into the channels. I'm going to destroy this alpha 1 that we had created for the stars. We don't need that. And I'm going to load RGB. I'm going to create a midtone mask here. So we've done this a few times. I'll go ahead and create this one. I'll duplicate it, invert it, select all, and I'll subtract them both from each other. So we'll go ahead and subtract. I'll turn these off. We don't need them after that. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create one more curves here. And we're going to call that our midtones. And that looks pretty good. So with our midtones, let's go ahead and move our midtones up. We'll lock this about here, and we'll just go ahead and add some nice contrast. So you can see those midtones can really pop out those values there. We don't have to go too ridiculous here, but basically, don't want to darken it too much, just want to lighten it up just a hair, just like that. Another global thing that I might want to do is just add one more curves layer on top of everything just to unify it a little bit. And I'm just going to bring the brightness up just a hair. I'm going to go ahead and lock the shadows down. And I'm going to use the arrow keys to make sure that that's right locked there, and you can see that I can bring up additional contrast to everything. One thing I might want to do with this contrast layer though is go back into the channels. Remember, we have our highlights layer here. Here's our shadow mask. If I take that shadow mask back again, inside the layers here, I'll go ahead and delete this mask. And I'll just go ahead and add it back to it. So my curves now are going to be a little bit easier because I can go ahead and change everything around those bright pixels without destroying them. So you can see I can add some global contrast to the entire image and start to get something that looks really nice. Let's go ahead, now that that's done, we'll go ahead and enable all of our color corrections together so that I can see this last curves. Just this is going to be sort of the icing on the cake. This is going to be that one final way to bring everything up. And let's go ahead and unlock this just to see how much I can bring the brightness up without hurting everything. And that looks pretty good. So we have this, and now it's time to make little fine-tune adjustments. Here we go, the curves right here. Let's make sure we like that. I do like that. I may actually want to transform it a little bit so it goes a little bit higher up. You don't have to redraw the gradient, you can just transform it. And I maybe want to change those values a little bit more like that. That looks pretty good, actually. I think that looks pretty good. All right, so it's about that time. Let's go ahead and see what we've done. Again, I'm using this green glow. If you guys don't like this green glow, feel free to use the other Milky Way image that I provided. I like it. I think it creates, it's kind of a very unique scene. I've never exactly seen this much glow in the sky with the yellow. It's a very cold scene. The other one's going to be cold as well, but you might be able to end up with a little bit more blue and purple and green on this one side. But for me, the Milky Way, coming all the way down here, is the most important element, the most important factor for me. So I can live with the air glow a little bit. I actually kind of like the way that it looks with all the different colors. Created something that's totally unique in my opinion. Let's go ahead and take a look at where we started. First thing I want to show you guys as far as before and afters go, here's if we would have just gone out in the middle of the night, not set up a blue hour shot, here's what we would have ended up with. And you can see it's literally a night and day difference. So all the elements are there to composite something, but here's what we ended up with. Here's what it looks like if we would have just stayed there, shot the church without the Milky Way. You can see that we have the church without the Milky Way. So basically, as a review, here's what we've been able to achieve. We started with a good base layer, and then we were able to add the lights in, which is pretty nice. We were able to clean things up, get rid of that post, then we added the Milky Way in, and you can see that everything's flat. Well, with some basic adjustments in Color Efex Pro, we were able to just pop those values back, get some of the life back into the image. Then, with some very simple color corrections based on masks that we had already generated, we already took the time to generate them, we were able to take it from this to its final state, which is really nice because anytime you come into this image, you can basically just make certain adjustments, let me turn them on obviously, to each thing. So if we look at that one more time, we have the state that came from Color Efex Pro and then our nice color corrections to really accentuate the Milky Way, glow on the horizon, everything's just coming to look like it belongs together. One more thing that we could do, I just want to show you guys if you want to darken part of the top of the sky. Here's a really interesting technique. Notice how we have this map here. Let's go back to the channels, and you can see I have an inverted selection here with the stars. Basically what I can do is I could add some contrast to the top by loading this, going back to the layers, but before I do that I'll turn this on. So we go back to the layers, I'm going to add one more layer on the top, and we're just going to call this curves, or we can do brightness and contrast, and I'm just going to darken up the top of the sky just a little bit, add a little bit of contrast. And what I'm going to do is just with a gradient here, I'm going to show you guys a little trick. Well, right now I want this to be affecting everything but the stars and the contrast, and if I change my blending mode to multiply on the mask and I draw a mask, let's say I want this fade to happen with this luminosity mask in place from the top and the bottom of the sky, all I have to do is this, and it'll just go ahead and apply that. So we'll just go ahead and make it a little bit harsher from the top and the bottom of the sky, and we'll take a look. And now we should just have that at the top of the sky. So we can add a little bit more darkness to the top of the sky there, and a little bit more contrast. We'll take a look. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and save this result. I think we can call it a day on this one. So I'll go ahead and save. That wraps things up for the Church of the Good Shepherd and the Milky Way above the church. It was an interesting lesson. There were a lot of problems that happened during filming. Thankfully, we were able to put it all together in the end with all the different layers, and I was able to introduce some new masking techniques. Now, some of these masking techniques that I use may be unfamiliar because we haven't used them so far. The reason that I put astrophotography at the end wasn't just because it was the most advanced concepts in shooting, but I knew that I was going to have to employ some more complex post-processing techniques that we may not have had a chance to use in the past. So I hope that all made sense. If it doesn't, just watch it a few times. Believe it or not, when you start working with this level of compositing, different f-stops together, different times of day, different noise ratios and ISO values, you're going to find them to be very valuable when you can just expand or contract in one pixel to be able to feather, and doing different kind of channel selections to get everything to work. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. The next time you see me in the post-processing studio, we're actually going to be taking the church from a different angle, and I'm going to be showing you guys how to put together star trails.